I've been told that you guys are an engaged, enthusiastic audience, so I'm going to do my best to keep my remarks relatively short so we can have a good conversation at the end. The only problem is every time I say that, I end up getting really excited and talking for way too long. So I'm going to do my best this time to keep it relatively short. So start thinking about things to talk about. I love the interactivity of how we can do this stuff. As was just mentioned, my name is Bryan Sivak, the Chief Technology Officer at the Department of Health and Human Services. And I thought I'd start off today with a quick story. In 2011, you guys probably remember this, the town of Joplin, Missouri was hit by a EF5 tornado. This is the highest level of tornado that you can possibly record. And you guys probably remember the scene. The town was pretty much devastated. There was over $1.5 billion worth of damage. Over 150 people lost their lives. One of the functions that HHS provides, which many people don't know about, is a preparedness and response function, which is run by a woman named Dr. Nicole Laurie, or Nikki Laurie. And she was telling me this story about how she went out to Joplin after the tornado to inspect the damage, to inspect the scene, and to try to coordinate and triage all of the assistance that we were providing. And she came across this guy who was wandering around the town, literally looking for a place to plug himself in. He had a left ventricular assist device, which, for those of you who don't know, is a device that helps pump blood through the heart. And it's electrically powered. He needed to find a place to essentially charge his batteries. But obviously, in a situation like the one in Joplin, the town was destroyed, the power was out, and he was having a hard time finding a place. Now, in situations like this, in disaster situations, what typically happens is that the folks who need power for durable medical equipment, this would be ventilators or dialysis machines or ventricular assist devices, would go to the ER, right? Because this is the last place that people would typically have access to power. But you don't really want that in a crisis situation, because you want the ERs to be used for traumatic injuries and for triage. You don't want a whole bunch of people lining the walls plugged in. The other problem was that in Joplin, the hospital itself was destroyed and was out of power. Now, it was okay in this particular case because a tornado is a very localized event, and this gentleman could be driven to a nearby town, could plug himself in, could find a place to actually power up. But what happens in the case where there's a hurricane or something that's much more widespread, like we saw with Superstorm Sandy, and people are just unable to get to a place to provide power to their devices? And so this is something that Nikki Laurie has been thinking a lot about, and is something that we've been working with her on to try to change the way that this problem is solved. And I'll get to a little bit, I just want you to keep that story in mind. I'll get to this in a minute. Now, I am sort of an accidental Govy. My background is software entrepreneur. I started an enterprise software company in San Francisco in '97. And in 2009, I was sort of randomly recruited into government by the mayor of Washington, D.C. at the time, Adrian Fenty, who was looking for a new CIO for the city. And it was interesting. It wasn't necessarily what I thought I would do. But as I thought about the opportunity, as I looked at what was possible, and kind of realized that deep down I had always had this desire to do some kind of public service, I pulled the trigger and went and moved to DC to take this job, and had 18 amazing months. Mayor Fenty, unfortunately, was unelected in his re-election campaign about 18 months after I started, and the new mayor, when he came in, kind of cleaned house, as new political elected officials are wont to do. But it was an amazing experience, because what I got to see was this ability to really help people that needed help by making some significant decisions that could be executed in relatively rapid fashion, because cities are so on the ground and so close to the action. And it sort of whetted my appetite for a lot of this stuff. After that job in DC, I was trying to figure out what to do, and I was introduced to Governor O'Malley in Maryland, who's an amazing guy, if any of you guys have ever met him. He's just one of the few politicians that I've come across that really understands this idea of how to manage an operation and how to get massive bureaucracies to kind of do the things that you need them to do. And so we started talking and ended up creating a position called the Chief Innovation Officer for the state, which was kind of created out of thin air. We both sort of made it up as we went along. And it was a ton of fun. My whole plan was to do that job through the end of his term, which is next year, and then go back to the private sector and do some other probably startup-y type stuff. I also had made 2 promises to myself. One, that I would never, that this would be my last job in the private or in the public sector. And then secondly, that I would never, ever, ever, under any circumstances, go work for the federal government. Because all of my interactions with the federal government to that point, from both DC and Maryland, had been nothing but bureaucracy and craziness and politics, and I'm just not that kind of guy. It's hard to get stuff done. And then I had coffee one day with Todd Park, who some of you might know. Todd was my predecessor at the Department of Health and Human Services, who is a very, very, very excitable guy, and passionate and incredibly convincing about all kinds of things. And so we had coffee because I had a whole bunch of things I wanted to do with him when he moved to the White House. And about halfway through the conversation, he stopped and said, wait, hang on, dude. I want you to do my old job. And I was like, what? This is not how that conversation was supposed to go. But I ended up thinking about it quite a bit. And while I didn't have a background in medicine or in public health, I come from a long line of doctors. My dad's a doc. His dad's a doc, my uncle's a doc. I was probably that close to becoming a doc at a certain point, and had always been interested in this idea of medicine and of public health. And the other thing that I really thought about was how this moment was spectacularly interesting as a transformative moment in this country for public health and for healthcare and for the delivery of human services. And the reason for that is simple. We spend $2.8 trillion a year on healthcare in this country. That's more than the next 10 countries combined in terms of overall spend. And the worst part is that for that additional spend, we actually don't even get better results. Our outcomes rank us 32nd. And so when you look at that data point, and I think you can agree with this, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or wherever you happen to sit on the political spectrum, the system needs to change. And everybody knows it. It's just a question of how we do that. And what I realized as I was thinking about doing this job is that because it was such a unique moment in time, and because we had had a few years now of pushing on the envelope to try to get things to change, it was just a fascinating opportunity to really make a difference. So I ended up taking the job. Now, as we spent some time, when I first got there, I spent some time looking around and trying to figure out exactly what it was that my group was doing, what I was supposed to do. And what I realized is that I have a tiny group at HHS. We're 10 people on a good day. And what I realized was that we had an opportunity to use ourselves almost as a fulcrum of a gigantic lever or a force multiplier, and the ability to basically leverage our skills and abilities within this tiny group to help make other people better, both inside and outside the department. So the way that I usually explain what we do is that we look for what I consider to be underutilized assets at the department, figure out how to drive more value through them, and then hopefully in doing so, build the foundations for the government of the next century. The first asset that my group really focused on then, if you look at that statement, is this idea of data. And for the past 3 years, we've spent a ton of time looking at this concept of all of the data that HHS either creates or curates or collects, and making it available to people outside government to do interesting and amazing things with. We started this 3 years ago. There were 45 people in a room at the Institute of Medicine and a pile of data on the table. I think there were 10 different data sets. And it was a day-long meeting. This meeting culminated in a challenge, which basically said to the 45 people sitting there, take these 10 data sets, come back in 90 days, and let's see what you can do. 90 days later, we were blown away by the fact that these people came back with 21 different applications that had not existed previously, all using HHS data that were transformative in some way, shape, or form. And it was that moment that the Health Data Palooza was born. Some of you might know the Health Data Palooza. It's the annual conference that we put on in DC. And this year, it just happened a few weeks ago, this year we had 2,000 people show up in Washington for 2.5 days to celebrate basically anything and everything related to health data. It was remarkable. Now, we've been successful, I think, over the last few years in this idea of data liberation, in this idea of taking the data that we have locked up in our silos and putting it out into the world. to the extent that we've actually changed the default setting within HHS. People now think of this idea of releasing data as what they should do, as opposed to locking it up and keeping it protected. And this was very, very different 3 years ago. You can see the results of this, actually, in some of the most recent things that the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, has released. CMS historically has been very protective of their data, for good reason. We don't want personally identifiable information, claims data getting out there into the wide world for obvious reasons. But at the same time, the pendulum had swung pretty far in the other direction in terms of locking it down and making it difficult to access. But you guys probably just saw a few weeks ago, we released hospital pricing data, which had never been released publicly free of charge. And these are the kinds of things that we're starting to think about and starting to see as people's minds and attitudes change towards recognizing what value and what power this data actually has to change the system. It's one of the key elements, if you think about it. If we want to change the way the payment system in this country works, if we want to change the way care delivery happens, it all requires access to information in order to make that happen. So we're continuing this push on the data front. The way that I like to think about it is that over the first few years, we've really thought about data dissemination from a sort of shotgun-style approach. We blasted the agency with this mandate to make data open and available. And for the most part, it's happened. There are still some recalcitrant holdouts. So focused data liberation is what we're working on as sort of one component of that. But there are a couple of other legs now that we want to really pay attention to. One of those is data dissemination. We have a platform called healthdata.gov. It's what we consider to be sort of our one-stop shop for health data. And this site has been up for about a year and a couple of months now. We need to do some work in terms of making it look better and act better. But what we really want to do is make this an engaging experience. We want people to come in and have conversations about the data. We want people to ask questions about how to use a certain data set or some examples of use of specific data sets. And so this is a big focus for what we're trying to do on the data front. The second pillar, or I should say the third pillar of this, is around engagement. One of the things that I've noticed over time is that in these sort of sclerotic industries that are ripe for disruption, the disruption usually comes from people who don't know anything about the industry itself. If you look at the way that Skype disrupted telephony, if you look at the way that Jeff Bezos and Amazon disrupted retail, et cetera, it's usually the people who don't know what they don't know, because they're not afraid to try these things. They have nothing. There's nothing in them that says, oh, this isn't going to work because it's too complicated. And I think healthcare is actually a phenomenal example of this. And what we're starting to see are lots and lots of little startups that are springing up that are solving problems, big problems in healthcare, by people who know nothing about the industry, by people who just have personal experiences and can think about, hey, wouldn't this be cool if? You're going to hear from one of my favorite examples of this, I believe, right after me, is a company called Aiden. And I won't steal their thunder, but it's a perfect example of a couple of guys who had a similar personal experience and recognized that actually with the use of some HHS-provided data, they could fundamentally transform an element of the ecosystem. Another great example is a company in California called Mango Health. Drug adherence and compliance, prescription adherence and compliance is a $200 billion problem in this country. And this guy who started this company had a personal experience where one of his family members had a problem with prescription adherence. He was a video game designer, and he realized that he could bring concepts from video game world into healthcare world and actually try to solve that problem. And so this is what we're starting to see. What I want to do is leverage the data that we have in such a way that we can include more of these people. And part of the challenge is that we've spent the last 3 years really talking to what I would consider to be subject matter experts in healthcare. Can you pull up the healthdata.gov screenshot? See if we get this up. So I have a question for you guys, and this is going to be actually really hard, unfortunately, to read. So how many people here, just out of sheer curiosity, are designers, developers, entrepreneurs, people who can do interesting things with data in general? Okay, fairly good number of you. How many of you guys are subject matter experts in healthcare? Good number of you as well. Okay. I want to read you the first sentence of the description of the National Plan and Provider Enumeration System. that's on healthdata.gov. It says the National Plan and Provider Enumeration System, or NPPES, downloadable file, also referred to as the NPI downloadable file, contains FOIA disclosable NPPES healthcare provider data for healthcare providers who have been assigned National Provider Identifiers, or NPIs. How many people here knows what that means? Few of you, right. This is, for all intents and purposes, this is not going to be an entirely accurate statement, but it's close enough, is a list of all of the doctors in the United States, their specialties, and where they're located. This is a pretty useful file if you're trying to do something in healthcare. It's a pretty useful data set, and it's updated on a relatively frequent basis. Now, there's some challenges with the accuracy of the information. There's some things that we have to do to fix it. But if you are doing something in healthcare, this is a good data set to have. But we don't describe it that way. So somebody who knows nothing about healthcare is going to have a real hard time finding this and doing something interesting about it. So we need to democratize these materials. Now, I haven't actually changed this example because I keep using it in my talks, so eventually we'll change it and I'll have to find a different one. But this is a great example of what I'm talking about. The second thing that we're doing, and this is something that hopefully we'll launch in the next few weeks, have you guys heard of something called Code Academy? It's an online sort of learn-to-code website. They've done a great job with teaching people how to write code. We're partnering with them to develop some classes around specific data sets that we have so that people can actually go onto Code Academy's website, sign up for these classes, and at the end of them, know exactly how to use these data sets, what the fields mean, how they're potentially useful, all of that kind of stuff. And so we're exploring all kinds of different ideas like that in order to try to engage more people in this ecosystem. So that's the data side. As I said, this is something that we've been focused on for the past few years, and it's really the first undervalued asset that we really considered at the department. The second one is one that we've recently started focusing on. And it's something that really struck me when I first got to government in DC a few years ago. When I first started at government, I had this stereotypical idea of what a government employee was, which I'm sure many of you share. It's the clock-punching bureaucrat who basically is there just riding out a pension and showing up at 10 and leaving at 4 and not really doing a lot of work. What I found was exactly the opposite. Now, sure, there are some people like that. These are massive organizations, but for the most part, everybody there is there for the right reasons. They're there because they want to do something interesting. They're definitely not there to get rich. They're there to help solve some very significant problems. But often, these people with the right intentions and these good ideas get sort of sucked down by the bureaucracy and by the red tape and by the risk aversion that exists in these organizations. And so one of the things that we realized was that if we could take the 90,000 people that work for the Department of Health and Human Services and activate some subset of these people, give them the ability to try new and interesting things, we actually had a chance at, again, using our small group as this fulcrum of a massive lever to change all kinds of things about the system. And so this is really the second thing that we've been focused on. Now, some people might call this workforce innovation. I've grown to kind of hate the word innovation, which I know sounds weird coming from somebody who had innovation in their title in the job before this one. But there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is simple. If I tell you guys to go and be innovative, what are you going to do? I don't know. I mean, it's such a vague word, and it's overused these days, and it doesn't really have much definition behind it. And so one of the things that we have used as the framework of this and a foundation of this is a new definition of an innovation, something that we can actually communicate to people that encodes action, and it's this. We believe that innovation is the direct result of the freedom to experiment. I can teach you how to experiment. I can teach you to develop a hypothesis. I can teach you to test that hypothesis, to generate metrics, and to factor those metrics into a next iteration of that experiment. The nice thing about experimentation is that it also encodes failure. It allows for failure, right? An experiment, by definition, does not always mean that it's going to be successful. And failure is something that government has a real hard time with. So if I can teach you how to experiment and I can make it okay to fail, then all of a sudden we have a group of people that are able to try new things. And then freedom is really a key factor, right? People in government are locked in. They typically have very specific tasks. They are hierarchically constrained. And so if we can figure out ways to both teach people how to experiment and then give them the freedom to do so, we believe that innovation of all sorts, both continuous and disruptive, will result. And so in order to achieve this, what we're really trying to do, and this is where I think one thing I should mention is that I actually have two titles. One of my titles is Chief Technology Officer. The other one is Entrepreneur in Residence. And in many ways, I focus more on the EIR side of things, because what we're really trying to do with all of this stuff is not necessarily leverage technology to change things. What we're actually trying to do is change the culture of a massive bureaucracy. And so what we've done to enable this is really build a framework of what I would consider to be 7 different programs that each have different goals, but all work together towards enabling the spirit of freedom and experimentation. The whole thing is based on a platform of collaboration. Some of you might know a guy named Tony Hsieh. He's the CEO of Zappos.com. One of the things that Tony Hsieh likes to say is that innovation and all of these new ideas are really, they really come from this concept of serendipitous collisions, the idea of people who have different backgrounds and different ideas and different cultures all coming together in one place and mixing it up and working together and allowing these concepts to kind of melt. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is take this idea of collaboration and build a framework, build a platform for the rest of these programs on that concept. And so to us, there are 2 elements of this. One is virtual. About 8 months ago, we set up a relatively straightforward internal professional networking platform. Think internal Facebook, if you will. And it's actually been kind of remarkable. This is something that you got to understand. HHS is a massive, incredibly hierarchical, very siloed organization. You're talking about groups like the National Institutes of Health, Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the Food and Drug Administration, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And these are groups that are geographically separate. And even though they work on many similar things, don't connect very well. There's lots of history in some cases. Each one of these organizations, as I've recently discovered, has their own sort of unique organizational psychology. It's very, very interesting. But the idea is if we can figure out a way to get all of these people talking together virtually, then we might have a shot at breaking down some of these silos. And so what's interesting is we launched this platform 8 months ago. We already have 15,000 people signed up for it, which I think is quite remarkable in the 8 months that we put it out there, especially given the risk aversion that government is typically part of. And so there have been some remarkable, to me, examples of this stuff working. I'll tell you one story. There's a guy named Ned Holland, who's the, I guess, number 4 guy at the Department of Health and Human Services. He's the Assistant Secretary for Administration. His job is to basically keep all the trains running on time. Ned was asked to speak at a conference in Kansas City a few months ago on innovation that's happening in the department. And so he got onto this platform and posted a message to the entire organization that said, hey, I'm looking for interesting, innovative ideas and things that we're doing that I can talk about in my talk. Now, what's interesting is not that Ned asked that question. Ned asks questions like that all the time, and he asks it to all kinds of people. But what's remarkable is that he got a ton of answers. And not just answers from people that reported to him. He got answers from all across the department at all levels. And this is remarkable precisely because people were talking to him directly. Typically, if I make a phone call, if I call somebody who's a few levels down in a bureau or an agency and say, hey, I heard you're working on something cool, I'd love to get together. Inevitably what happens is that 13 people show up to a meeting because they tell their boss and their boss tells their boss and et cetera. And everybody kind of comes together in one big room. But what this platform has been able to do is democratize communication and democratize collaboration so that everybody can communicate with each other without going through their chain of command and provide good ideas. And so this example to me was a perfect one to illustrate the potential. Now the other side of this is the physical side. Have any of you guys been to the Hubert H. Humphrey building in Washington, D.C., the headquarters of HHS? Okay, so some of you know this is I find it kind of funny. It's the building itself is in the brutalist style of architecture, which is somewhat ironic for the Health and Human Services Agency. But if you walk into the building and you kind of go into one of these office areas, all you see are cubicles that go to the sky. Nobody walking around. It's sort of no windows that are visible. It's not necessarily the most conducive physical environment to interesting thought. And it's certainly not conducive to this idea of serendipitous collision. The only thing that you're going to run into in many of these places is air. And so what we're trying to do is actually build a physical space that allows people to come together and to serendipitously collide if they can. And we're calling this HHS Labs. We're looking at building this in a specific section of one of the buildings that we have in that complex down in DC. And one of the things that we're actually trying to do is not just make this available for internal people. A lot of folks that we deal with on a regular basis, and I'm sure a lot of you guys come down to DC on a regular basis for meetings, for conferences, what have you, but there's often downtime. You've often got a couple hours to kill between, say, meetings on the Hill or meetings somewhere else. Wouldn't it be great if you could come and camp out in our space, make a couple of phone calls, write a couple of emails, hang out with us, talk to us, talk to people that you never get a chance to interact with, and vice versa. And I think that if we can enable this to happen, then we have an opportunity to really do some very interesting cross-pollination and fertilization of ideas that never would happen otherwise. And so this is one of the concepts that we're working on right now. That's the foundation layer. It's collaboration. On top of that, what we want to try to do is identify people inside the department who are actively working on interesting things or have ideas to work on interesting things and give them the tools that they need and the freedom that they need to execute on this stuff. And so we have two programs that we're putting in place right now that are designed to do that. The first one is called HHS Fair Trade. And this is best illustrated by a story. There's a woman named Gwen Shinko who works for the National Institute for Allergies and Infectious Diseases, which is a part of NIH. Gwen was out for a run. This actually happened a couple of years ago. She was out for a run one day. And while jogging along, she had this thought. She said, we've got all this lab equipment at NIH that gets replaced on a regular basis. So, we might have a centrifuge that spins at 10,000 RPM, but there's one that now spins at 12,000 RPM, and that one's much better, so we're going to trade in the old one and get the new one. But she wondered what happened to all the old lab equipment, because she knew that it worked and that there were probably people who could use it in various labs within NIH, but they just sort of disappeared. So she did a little digging when she got back from her run, and it turns out that these things just sort of disappeared into the great NIH warehouse in the sky, never to be heard from again, even though they were perfectly functional and could be used. And so Gwen said, that's silly. We should have a Craigslist for stuff at NIH. But the problem was that Gwen had never built a website. She'd never racked a server. She didn't know how to do any of this stuff. But luckily, she knew people who she worked with who did. And so she called up a couple of folks, one of whom was a coder, another one was a designer, another IT guy, and said, hey, can you help me put this together? And she built it. She called it NIH Free Stuff. And the growth was relatively remarkable. She put it out there, spooled it up. People at NIAID started using it. Just a few months ago, it was presented to the director of the National Institutes of Health, Francis Collins. He saw it, thought it was a great idea, and said, we should roll this out across the entire NIH. What I would love to do is roll it out across the entire government. Why not? I mean, this is the idea of being able to move equipment and things back and forth without having to buy new stuff is a great idea. But at a more fundamental level, what we recognize is that this idea that Gwen had would not have happened if she hadn't known the people that could help her make it happen. And there are tons and tons and tons of examples of this across HHS. And so what Fairtrade is, in a lot of ways, think about it like Kickstarter for internal resources. We want people who have these ideas to present these ideas out there and ask for the specific resources that they need in order to help execute those ideas, get commitments for those things, and when they reach the targets, they get cashed in, and then the people are off to the races. So this is something that we're building right now, and the idea is that we can identify some of these early adopters by the people who post their ideas on this site. Second program in this category is called HHS Ignite. And this one has been remarkable also in the first couple of months that we put it out there. So we launched this 2 months ago. The whole idea for Ignite is simple: seed funding for new ideas. In government, it's very, very, very difficult to get funding lines allocated, especially in this environment, for new projects or new programs. It's much, much, much easier to get existing line items continued to be funded. And so what we wanted to do was provide an opportunity for people who had ideas to actually execute on these things. And so it's not a big program. We had $80,000, and we said, okay, we're going to give $10,000 to each of 8 projects that meet certain criteria that can be executed in 3 to 6 months to prove a point, and that have the ability to transform some aspect of the work that we do in HHS. So we put out this call for applications. We didn't do a lot of marketing. It's a beta, after all. We only had space for 8 applicants, and so we figured we'd get 15 to 20 applications in this first round. We left it open for a month. When it closed, we had 67 applications from across the department, which is remarkable considering that each one of these people had to not only put together a relatively robust proposal, had to think about the problem they were trying to solve, had to come up with metrics that they were going to use to measure and benchmark it, but they also had to get sign-off from their manager, because one of the key elements of this program is not so much the money, but it's the time. What we said was, because the secretary is going to be essentially making her selections, you as the people who are responsible for this will get either 50% of your time for 6 months or 100% of your time for 3 months to be able to work on this. And that's something that's very, very, very different than the way government typically works. So we just selected the first round of projects. What was kind of interesting is that when you looked at these 67, we went through a relatively robust scoring process to grade them, and it turned out to be a perfect bell curve. There were some that were not so great. There were a bunch that were pretty good, and then there were 13 that were excellent. And when I went to the secretary and I said, here are 13 projects that we need you to select 8 from. She read through them and looked up at me and said, can't we just do all 13? And I said, well, if you can find me the money, we can do all 13. She said, I can find you the money. So we're now doing 13 projects in this program, which is remarkable. There are some really great ones. A good example is Center for Disease Control and Prevention has this idea to do a micro-tasking project. Basically, tasks that can take from, say, a minute to a day that can be farmed out to graduate students or academics or researchers or basically anybody who wants to be involved with some of the things the government does and actually get paid for it and do interesting things. And so this is one of the things that they're trying to set up, build this platform for microtasking. National Institutes of Health, one of the projects that they were selected to do is building a library of 3D printable models for scientific objects, molecules, and things like that that can be used in education, and to create this sort of definitive database for these 3D printed models. And so lots of cool stuff like that that wouldn't have happened otherwise, but are great ideas for advancing the causes of a lot of the stuff that we're trying to work on. And again, in doing so, we're trying to identify the people inside the department that are doing interesting things. Now, the layer above that, that was all the finding the internal people. The layer above that, we recognize that over time, we need to figure out ways of bringing external ideas into the department and to bring external people in that are not necessarily encumbered by the bureaucracy and the red tape and some of the hierarchy that exists within the organization. And so there are 2 programs here as well. The first one is called it's called HHS Competes, which is based on the America Competes legislation. This is our prizes and challenges program. We've done over 100 competitions in the last 2 years. We've given away millions of dollars. We've developed some really, really interesting projects and responses to some of these challenges. One of the most recent ones was a winner of a competition that we announced at the Health Data Palooza. This is the My Air, My Health Challenge. And this was a 2-phase competition, which was basically designed to say, how can you develop a wearable air quality sensor that tells the user at that moment in time if the air that they're breathing at that moment is good, clean air, right? And also records that information to a database in the cloud so that we can actually track all of this stuff and see now patterns of where air quality is good and bad and start to link that to some public health conditions. The team that won, is what they came up with is remarkable. It's like this amazing stretchy fabric that is conductive, and it's pretty cool stuff. I recommend going to the My Air, My Health Challenge website to check it out. So the compete stuff is going strong. You can check out all of the competitions that we have on challenge.gov. It's the sort of main hub for where all of the federal government posts their challenge competitions. And if you filter on HHS, you'll see all of the ones that we currently have active and the past challenges. The second piece of this is a program called HHS Entrepreneurs. Now, this one we started very shortly after I arrived about a year ago. And the idea here is essentially to bring in external people, external entrepreneurs who can help the department solve what we consider to be some of our highest risk, highest reward challenges. And the catch is that they only have 12 months to do it. we bring people in for a period of 12 months, and then they go away. And so these folks that come in have to figure out ways of doing things differently than we typically do if they want to execute on this. We have 4 projects in this first round, all of which are transformative in one way or another. We have a project that is designed to help make the nation's organ donor transplant system more efficient. We have a project that's designed to leverage an element of what we're building for the federal health insurance marketplace so that states can actually take advantage of some of the work that we're doing. We have a project that's bringing lean thinking techniques into some of these sort of staid cultures. And we have another project, this is the one that I talked about at the very beginning, which is designed to help locate people in disaster situations and direct resources to the people that need it the most at that period of time. Now, each one of these has been fascinating to watch happen over the 8 months that these folks have been there, because each one of these people have run into all kinds of crazy challenges, which are different depending on the different organizations that they work in. And watching the ways that they've kind of overcome those challenges, or the ways that they've started to think about doing things differently, has really been eye-opening for me, and more importantly for the career civil servants that they're partnered with in these agencies. Because the goal of this is not necessarily to successfully execute on these projects. Obviously, we'd love to see these projects be successfully executed on, but the real goal is to infuse this idea of creativity and of risk-taking and of challenging the status quo into the career civil service so that they can start to think about ways to do things differently in the future. So this has been an amazing success from that perspective, just because of the ways that people have started to think differently about this stuff. And when I'll get phone calls from the career civil servants who are partnered with these folks saying, we had no idea this was possible. We're now starting to think about how we do things in different ways. A great example of this is one of the projects is all about bringing lean thinking, as I mentioned, into the CMS and ONC, the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT. And one of the career civil servants that I was talking to a little while ago said, now that I've learned this lean stuff, it's sort of infected my entire life. She said, in fact, I've optimized my grocery shopping based on lean, which to me is the ultimate validation for culture change, right? It's in your personal life. So the one big ask here, we just launched the next round of HHS entrepreneurs. You can find all of the details on hhs.gov/open. And if you or anybody you know is interested in coming into the federal government for a 12-month stint to break some eggs, to do things a little bit differently, to kind of challenge how things currently work, and to help us execute on some of what we think are purely transformative projects, please do apply. It's important to note, too, that these are not necessarily technology-related things. Some of them are, right? But some of these next round projects, we're looking for people who have skills in design thinking. We're looking for people who have organizational design skills. It's all over the map. And so please go to this website, take a look at it, see if there's anything that strikes your fancy. If there's somebody you know, forward it to them. We have the applications open from now until August 16th, and so it's not that long of a time, but we're looking forward to it. So that's entrepreneurs. Finally, the last piece of this puzzle is what I like to consider the viral growth engine of the whole thing. Now we can kind of teach people how to do all this stuff, how to experiment, how to give them the freedom to do it. But if the message that they're doing it and that it's accepted and that this is something that we want to see doesn't get out there, then it'll just kind of wither and die on the vine. So the last program here is something called HHS Innovates, which is really just a recognition program. It's a program where people within the department can nominate their peers or nominate themselves for these interesting ideas and these interesting projects. The entire department and the public will vote on these things. And the top 6 vote getters go to the secretary for her top 3 selections. Now, the people who win this, not only they do get a check, which is nice. It's not a big check. But the thing that really drives the participation is not the money, but it's the recognition. It's standing up there with the secretary, having a conversation with her about the work that you're doing, having her recognize that this is something that is valuable and interesting and useful. And it's been really interesting to watch how when somebody wins this, what happens both to them after they get back into their home agencies, but also the people that surround them, because they say, wow, these guys tried something interesting, Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But they got recognized for it, and they were encouraged to continue to do this stuff. And so actually, one of my favorite examples of this is a winner of HHS Innovates about a year ago. And the Center for Disease Control, one of the things that they do is emergency preparedness, right? They're the guys who tell you to like have 18 gallons of water in your basement and lots of batteries for your flashlights and radios and all this other stuff. And they wanted to get the message out in more of an interesting viral way. So they created this campaign called the Zombie Apocalypse, which some of you guys might have seen. And basically it's pretty simple. It's like, get prepared because there might be a zombie apocalypse coming. And this is a year ago when zombies were really popular and all over the news and stuff like that. You got to understand is that CDC doesn't do zombies, right? It's the CDC. They're serious and they're scientists. And so this was hard to get through the sort of bureaucracy and the PR police and the lawyers and all that. But they managed to get it through. And what was pretty cool, I think, is that this campaign cost them a grand total of $87 to produce. And in the first week that it launched, it generated 3.6 billion impressions. As anybody who's ever done marketing before, that's a pretty good ROI, right? And so the zombie apocalypse was a massive success. Actually, and my favorite, let's see if this works, my favorite sort of end result of this was this video. Can we put that video up? If you can play this.
Sure. Well, Mr. Speaker, I rise today to salute the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta and the province of Quebec for putting in place emergency measures to deal with the possibility of an invasion of zombies. Now, I don't need to tell you, Mr. Speaker, that zombies don't recognize borders and that a zombie invasion in the United States could easily turn into a continent-wide pandemic if it's not contained. So on behalf of concerned Canadians everywhere, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Minister of Foreign Affairs, is he working with his American counterparts to develop an international zombie strategy so that a zombie invasion does not turn into a zombie apocalypse?
The Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I want to assure this member and all Canadians that I am dedicated to ensuring that this never happens. I want to say categorically to this member and through him to all Canadians that under the leadership of this Prime Minister, Canada will never become a safe haven for zombies, ever.
So that was the Canadian Parliament legitimately debating the zombie apocalypse. Thanks to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Again, could you ask for better marketing ROI, right? So it's one of my favorite examples because what it shows is that if you do something different, if you do something interesting, then we have the ability, there's the opportunity to really move the needle on a lot of stuff. And so if we can continue to recognize these things and to challenge the status quo and to prop up the people who have done good work and to continue this idea of experimentation and freedom within the department, I really believe that we can move the needle on literally everything that we're trying to do. And so with that, just a few things I want to remind you guys as takeaways. Number one, continue to use our data. Ask us questions about it. Let us know if there are data sets that you want to see, that if there are things that you think make sense or don't make sense. We want to know all of this stuff so it can help prioritize our efforts. Number two, go to hhs.open, take a look at the HHS Entrepreneurs projects that are existing in the second round and apply or tell people about them that can apply because we're looking for the next group of insanely talented people who can help us make a huge difference in this world. And with that, I want to thank you guys very much. I talked way longer again than I thought I would, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. I see a couple of hands there and back there.
Thank you. Great overview. I was glad to see the hospital charge data that came out recently. Mm-hmm. I'm curious if there's sort of a plan of attack as you guys are thinking about the release of data. Have you thought about, what you'll be releasing when and why?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we're constantly thinking about. And actually, one of the interesting things that happened when we released that hospital pricing data, I was talking to the Deputy Secretary, Bill Corr, about it. And when that data set was released in the first week, there was something like 200,000 downloads of the data set, so it was a pretty well-accessed release. And I was telling him that story, and he looked at me and he said, "That's great. What are we doing next?" Which is great because that gives me the ability to go to any group in the department and say, "Hey, they're interested in doing this. They want to do it. And so what are we going to do?" There's a whole bunch of stuff under consideration. CMS is really, I think, the gold mine for a lot of this stuff because they're the ones that have within the Medicare claims data set a ton of information that could potentially be used to change the system in some way. But again, we have to be careful because we don't want any PII or any personal health information to get out there. And so we're looking at different elements and different things that we could release that would actually make a difference. To that end, if there are suggestions, we're happy to take them. So if you guys have any ideas and you want to send them our way, let us know. But just know that this is something that we're continually thinking about, and it's something that we will continue to do on a very regular basis. I don't know if you guys saw the president released an executive order about a month ago mandating sort of this idea of open data across the entire government. And so this really has visibility and not just visibility, but drive from the highest levels of government. So this is not something that we're giving up on.
In what ways do you think you can help the ACA and healthcare reform be less sclerotic?
Well, so one thing I would point you to is the most recent release of healthdata.gov. Did you guys see the relaunch of healthdata.gov recently, a couple weeks ago? Any of you? So basically sorry, I meant healthcare.gov, I'm sorry. Healthcare.gov is really the one-stop shop for information about healthcare and the Affordable Care Act. And had existed for a couple of years in what I would consider to be somewhat of a wonky form, meant for journalists, meant for academics, meant for researchers, and somewhat meant for citizens who are looking for information about what the healthcare law meant for them. Healthcare.gov on October 1st, 2013 will be a website where people can go to check eligibility and then compare insurance plans and then sign up for insurance. And as a preview to that, we launched a couple of weeks ago the sort of new look and feel and the new version of healthcare.gov. But we did it in a way that was, I think, very, very different for any government organization. Instead of hiring a massive government contractor and building what I would consider to be a government website, and you can kind of see what it looks like here. This is not your grandfather's or your father's government website. In fact, it's not your slightly older brother's government website. This is something that we designed in a way that was meant to emulate some of the an e-commerce shopping experience, right? Something that you would see on Amazon, something that you would see on Zappos, because this is what people are familiar with. I don't know how geeky you guys are here, so I'll keep this at a relatively high level, but the way that this is built is actually incredibly important. It's not using expensive proprietary software. It's not using massive application servers from IBM or Oracle. We built it 100% on open source code. We built everything with the idea that we would release both the code and the content into the public, that anybody could take this code and reuse it, modify it, submit pull requests for us to incorporate changes. And we're already starting to see that happen, which is amazing to me. People are reading our content and finding, for example, typos and saying, hey, you got a typo here. And we're able to now pull that in on the fly so that this site can be accurate, up-to-date, correct at that moment. And so without getting too geeky, it's, I think, a watershed moment for how we're approaching this stuff. And this is how we're going to continue doing it. It's a complicated thing, right? Both from a policy perspective and from a technology perspective when we're talking about integrating with IRS and SSA and DHS and all of the states that have to interact with us in order to get information. But we're trying to think about things in ways that governments typically don't, that make more sense, both for us and for the taxpayer. Yeah, back there.
Hi, Brian. Barry Chester from Pfizer. I love the idea of democratizing this information, and I'll take a far-out example of electronic medical records. And what if I could have mine on my iPad, and I become now can direct my consumption of healthcare as opposed to sort of reacting to things that are coming my way. There could be nice innovative solutions for making that happen, all of the HIPAA compliance and all that aside. But just using that as an example, how does HHS have a role in being able to get critical mass behind whatever the solution might be to that particular problem? So it becomes a standard as opposed to a very fragmented piecemeal solution, which we see a lot of, right? The electronic medical records. Everyone takes a run at it,
Sure.
but it's losing the network power, whereas if that was standardized, now all of a sudden it's enormously valuable, not only to every particular user, but to the overall network.
I am super glad you asked that question. So interoperability of electronic medical record systems is obviously one of the key components of the Meaningful Use Program, especially Stage 2. And one of the core components of that is this thing called view, download, and transmit. One of the requirements is that in order to meet Meaningful Use Stage 2 requirements, these systems must be able to allow patients to view, download, or transmit their medical record between systems. One of the ways that we've done this, or that we're encouraging people to do this, is by developing something called Blue Button. You guys heard of Blue Button? Anybody here? A few of you? Okay. So,
come on, you've all heard of Blue Button, come on.
Hopefully. I mean, the marketing aspect of it is something that I think we still have to work on. What Blue Button is essentially a standard which defines the content structure for a medical record. It defines a transport mechanism for that medical record, and it defines a security scheme and a trust mechanism to allow people to authenticate and prove that they are the data holders. We released what's called the Blue Button Plus specification, which was actually created in collaboration with all kinds of people across the industry a couple of months ago. And some of the really big names in EHR systems have actually started to implement this stuff. We just heard last week that Cerner has built Blue Button Plus into the most recent version of their system, which is fantastic because that means that anybody who's going to use or implement that system will automatically have access to this stuff. The Veterans Administration is building Blue Button Plus. They're upgrading the current version of Blue Button to Blue Button Plus in their systems, so that they're obviously a massive data holder. And CMS, sort of the daddy of them all in terms of data scope, is actually building Blue Button Plus into their system as well.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So pretty soon we're going to have a massive ecosystem of data providers. What you're going to see next, we hope, is a massive ecosystem of data receivers and interesting applications that are based off of this information. So if you can imagine, if I have access to all of my medical records, either claims or clinical data, via this mechanism, then you can imagine all kinds of different applications that will spring up to receive this data and do interesting things with it, and frankly, some that we can't even imagine today. So this is really, we're putting a lot of wood behind this arrow. We're continuing to do a lot of marketing and outreach on this, trying to get some of the more of the data holders to actually build this functionality in. We're trying to encourage entrepreneurs and developers to use this functionality to build applications. There's a conference on Friday in San Francisco designed exactly for that. And so this is something that I encourage everybody here to pay attention to go to the bluebuttonplus.org website, check out the specs, look at what it actually contains, what the roadmap is for the future, and try to figure out ways that you can use this information in a fashion that will allow us to help transform the system.
I think that's all we have time for. Thank you very much, Bryan.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.